Good evening, I'm Homi Bhabha, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this fascinating event on origin stories, and my thanks to our remarkable group of speakers. Stephen Greenblatt is John Cogan University Professor of the Humanities at Harvard. His most recent book is The Rise and Fall of Adam and Eve. His previous book, The Swerve, won the Pulitzer Prize in 2012 and the 2011 National Book Award for Nonfiction. Kimberly Patton is Professor of the Comparative and Historical Study of Religion at the Harvard Divinity School. She specializes in ancient Greek religion and archaeology with research interests in archaic sanctuaries and the iconography of sacrifice. Her most recent book is Religion of the Gods, Ritual, Paradox, and Reflexivity. Meredith Reiches, did I get it?
Beautifully done.
All right.
Beautiful.
Is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at UMass Boston. In her interdisciplinary work on adolescence, she seeks to tease out the narrative elements in the acts of conducting and communicating science, and to analyze these side by side with literary narratives of coming of age, asking the question, what does it take to make the transition from childhood to adulthood in human society? Richard Wrangham is Ruth Beamer Professor of Biological Anthropology at Harvard and founder of the Kimberley Chimpanzee Project. Does that say that right?
Beautifully.
Okay. He's best known for his work on the evolution of human warfare, described in the book Demonic Males, and on the role of cooking in human evolution, described in the book Catching Fire, How Cooking Made Us Human. Amongst the many wonders of Stephen Greenblatt's new book is the belated invitation we receive to the garden party. After being expelled from paradise at the very start of the story, the epilogue finally lays on the garden party at Uganda's Kibale National Park in the company of the chimpanzees. And here in the Ugandan research station, at a great distance from Harvard's Heart of Darkness, for a brief, fleeting moment, time stands still, and Stephen experiences a kind of Edenic tranquility. Let me quote him. "This, then, I thought, is what paradise must have been. No permanent address, no planting and cultivating, and at that dizzying height, the chimps are up in their nests, no predators and no fear. I had glimpsed a part of that ancient dream of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat." Are paradisal moments, originary and mythic, so compelling to our sense of identity and belonging, our ancestry and its tradition, because they are naturally and historically vicarious and voyeuristic? If hell is other people, paradise is also other people or other places. Reading Stephen left me with a stray thought. Are myths of origin less about the primal moment of being or becoming, and more about constructing a narrative about recovery or rediscovering the self, the legitimation for a cultural and political self-fashioning? The political identification with myths of origins, in our times at least, have an unerringly atavistic and iterative address. The fundamentalists return to the unchanging reality of Hindu scriptures, fables, and myths of origin in India today are formulated as the recovery of a pure Hindutva identity in the face of a predatory secular modernity and what they see as an expanding Islamic hegemony. I think you could make this argument for many of the revivals of origin myths now. They're sort of the recovery of a self in the face of some kind of pursuit or some kind of predation. When we ask ourselves, who are we? Why are we here? What is the purpose of our lives and deaths? The seeming emphasis on origin and ontology, on person and place, is a strange tangle of temporalities, a future anterior whose complex representation is, of course, the aspiration of great narrative art. the poiesis of literature, painting, ritual, and even scientific discourse. Stephen's inspired portrait of Dürer at work on the fall of man, and I quote him, "A figure made up of beautiful pieces of bodies stitched together to an idealizing geometrical scheme drawn from a pagan idol, is a motif of the techne of aesthetic assemblage that gives the myth of Adam and Eve its narrative powers of refreshment, of permanence, as well as iteration at the same time." Myths of origins are often located in spaces which become sites of transgression and expulsion. They are concurrently temporalities of transition. Balanced on the liminal edge between transgression and transition, originary narratives have the tensile capacity to endure the pressure that is required for them to be extended, repeated, and revised in time and space. Stephen's fascination with the trace of loss as the locus of invention or reinvention, of repetition as the locus of recognition, is at the heart of his work, both in The Swerve and his reworking of Adam and Eve. But a loss of this kind, a loss to be found again, is strangely a gain. Recovering what is lost, Stephen once wrote, requires, and I quote him, one to venture out to unfamiliar cultural texts, and these texts, often marginal, odd, fragmentary, unexpected, and crude, in turn could begin to interact in interesting ways with the intimately familiar works of the literary canon. The panel today, of course, precisely illustrates this point. Unfamiliar cultural texts that Stephen has turned into neighbors and friends and sometimes antagonists coming together for what I'm sure will be a very illuminating discussion. Thank you all very much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Homi, for the eloquent introduction, and to the Mahindra Center for hosting this occasion. Homi asked me now some time ago if I would like to do something at the Mahindra Center to mark the publication of my book on Adam and Eve, and that was very gracious of him. And I said I would love to do something if we could possibly think of a way of bringing together my particular literary interests with theology and with evolutionary biology and with anthropology, and marvelously, here we are. What we propose to do is speak very, very briefly, each of us, for 8 to 10 minutes, and then have some conversation among ourselves in the mode of the garden party, and then open the floor up to questions from you. So I'll say just a few things briefly about my own interests, which, as I suppose befits my disciplinary training, have to do with fascination with stories, with narrative, and with extremely powerful stories, of which this is probably the single most spectacular in the Western tradition, of a story that had enormous impact, consequences, and diffusion in the world of the Near East and the West, especially the Christian world. The story, which originates, as you I'm sure know, in the Hebrew world, but probably in an oral culture that precedes the invention of what we think of as Judaism, but goes back probably well before that. The story gets picked up, told in the book of Genesis, gets embraced after considerable argument by Christianity, gets transmitted and enters also the Muslim world, and therefore penetrates very fully in an enormous, over an enormous population, and a huge amount of time. It's a story that, as origin stories do, it's a story, in this case, that in a very tiny compass attempts to explain a great many things, almost everything. Certainly the origin of our species, also species dominance, which is announced in the Genesis story. It attempts to explain, or at least give you a depiction of the origin of pair bonding, culminating in that moment at which the woman is brought to the man, evidently taken from the man's body, but brought back to him after what the ancient rabbis thought was possibly an abortive attempt to introduce Adam to the other animals and have one of them chosen as his mate. Then, of course, transgression, and then the origin of shame, so that a somatic as well as a moral or ethical problem. The nature of labor, why we have to work and sweat, why women experience excruciating pain in childbirth, why we die, why the earth the world doesn't keep us going and we can't continue in the world. And then a suite of issues that, as so many of these issues that I'm describing have problems of that are in the boundary between ethics and biology, including what appears to be a curse or a punishment, as it's described in the Bible, of male domination of women, and then what again the Bible singles out as something to think about, the fact that women continue to desire the creatures who dominate them. It's one of the strangest things about the Genesis account is that that strange half a verse, Genesis 3:16, in which whoever told the story thought that it needed explanation, that it shouldn't be taken for granted that men dominate women or that women desire men in those circumstances, but needed to be explained as a punishment for transgression. That's worth reflecting, I think, on. At least it is for me a source of surprise, and it was even a source of surprise for many commentators in the 17th century, when this issue in 17th century of our era, when this issue was focused on. Of course, it upset the male theologians, who said, of course, the men were intended to dominate women even in paradise. It's just that women would have enjoyed it more than the experience of finding it disagreeable must be part of the punishment. In any case, this is one of the reasons. These issues are among the reasons why the Joseph Kerner in art history and I have taught this course in the general education program of ethical reasoning, because you can watch the story as it evolves as a story about a long-term project of human attempt to understand ethical life. That project, which continues actually into the 19th and 20th century, and much of what Homi said in introducing us about the liminal or transitional moment is precisely what obsessed, for example, Kierkegaard, in thinking about how you would get from innocence to guilt or culpability, what kind of threshold you'd have to cross. That kind of ethical thinking, philosophical thinking, doesn't involve believing that the story in any sense is literally true. But my own book is about the long-term and extraordinary project especially in Christian culture, and especially in Christian culture after St. Augustine, to make people believe that the story is literally true. So to defeat, in effect, the allegorists, whether they were Jews like Philo or Christians like Origen, and to make a central doctrine of the faith, be the literal interpretation of the story of Adam and Eve. And that leads us continues all the way into our present world in which, if we can believe the polls, 40% of our fellow countrymen in the United States profess to believe in the literal truth of the story, even though it's rather difficult to coordinate that literal belief with virtually everything that we know about the world since at least the late 18th century. So the project of making it literal, of making it real as it was understood by the Renaissance, is at the very center of my book. And that plot, which I won't take the time to describe now, has to do with serious people grappling with what it means to make anything real, but particularly this story real. A story about a naked man and woman and a talking snake in a magical garden with weird trees is not obviously to be taken literally. And that was true 2,000 or 3,000 years ago as well. They weren't actually dumber than we are. So they understood that the story has all the elements of a fairy tale or a myth. And to make people actually think that it is literally true required an enormous effort of will, but also of intelligence, symbolic intelligence, and also of art making. So that it's the triumph finally of technology, of Renaissance technology, to actually give us Durer's Adam and Eve, or Michelangelo's or Titian's, but also to give us Milton's Adam and Eve, to give us creatures who seem actually to be taken literally, to be evidence of the reality of the story. And those attempts had to grapple with a set of things that are extremely difficult. Difficult already before Darwin came along in the 19th century to blow the whole thing open. But questions, for example, about how creatures who evidently did not know what death was, because there was no death in the garden, could ever understand what death was, or how you begin to speak if you're apparently born into the world as an adult without an infancy or childhood, or what it would mean to obey a prohibition. If the prohibition actually kept you from knowing the difference between good and evil, just lies at the very center of the story. That is to say, people grasped already several thousand years ago that this was a story written by Franz Kafka. And they struggled for centuries. Many of the most interesting, I think, people in the whole Western tradition struggled with how to explain, how to grapple with things that are built in a deep way, hardwired into the story. We will turn to the other members of the panel now, but I just want to say that hovering, at least for me, over our own relation to the story, my own relation to the story in the 21st century, is to try to understand when the moral features that figure so prominently in the Genesis story, disobedience, the search for knowledge, the experience of shame, the feeling of not being in the place that you should be, a feeling of exile, when did these appear? If in the world that we now believe must have been the world of our ancestors, not Adam and Eve in the paradisal garden, but the world of primates. When could these have come into the world? And when into the world did we get, and how did we get symbolic acts? Did we get aesthetic acts? Were they already in our primate ancestors? Did we get varieties of cooperation and collaboration that lead us to the creatures that we are now? This is just a way of beginning, and I'm excited to turn the microphone over to Kimberly Patton, who will pick up from here.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm honored to be here. It's always a pleasure to be in a space at Harvard that allows religionists and scientists to actually talk to one another. These are the conversations we need to be having, especially now. As we're reminded in the news this week by a pending Supreme Court case for a wedding cake never baked for two grooms in Colorado, the story of Adam and Eve is alive and well in our culture and protected by the mantle of religious belief. Or is it? Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, continue to run a parallel race alongside the changing and contested global understanding of the range of human sexualities, the ethics and political discourse that result from that, and the civil protections of legal marriage. In another lane runs evolutionary biology and our evolving understanding of it. Yet no one seems to be staying in their lane. Reality and our experience of it continues to be interdisciplinary, a palimpsest of many layers. Freud wrote in Future of an Illusion that religion would be outgrown as science ascended and human beings became more willing to let go of their paternalistic God figure, embracing our terrifying vulnerability and existential aloneness in an uncaring universe. The sociologists of the 1960s predicted that religion was atrophying into a colorful set of illuminations in the margins of the pre-Enlightenment. And my own wonderful professor of paleontology, Stephen Jay Gould, did not share Darwin's unhappiness with the increasing ascendant role that evolution plays in the thinking of some of the world. And he invited humanity to get real and grow up in a world of stasis and sudden replacement, a world free of fantasy, free of story, the real world. None of this happened, and lived religion remains stubbornly persistent in many areas, more fundamentally dug in than ever before. In The Rise of Adam and Eve, Stephen Greenblatt is both fascinated and troubled by the persistence of a tale that he says bears the hallmark, and I'm quoting, of the imagination at its most extravagant. A magical garden, a naked man and woman who are brought into existence in a way that no other human beings have been born. People who know how to speak and function without the prolonged childhood that is the hallmark of our species. A mysterious warning about death that no such newly created beings could possibly understand, a talking snake, a tree that confers knowledge of good and evil, another tree that confers eternal life, supernatural guardians wielding flaming swords. This is fiction at its most fictional, a story that revels in the delights of make-believe. Joni Mitchell, left out of Woodstock through a scheduling error, wanted it both ways. We are stardust. We are golden. We are 50 billion-year-old carbon, and we've got to get ourselves back to the garden. The author's fundamental question is why Adam and Eve, whom he argues epitomize, quote, the weird enduring power of human storytelling, began to bear insistence on the literal truth, which he attributes, as he says, to Christian orthodoxy, following Augustine and then into the Renaissance. How does something made up become so compellingly real, he asks. What happens when fictional creatures behave as if they were alive? Are they fated for that reason to begin to die? Professor Greenblatt gives us a masterful, deeply researched tale that allows us to peer both backwards and forwards in its genealogy of stories about the origin of the cosmos and of humankind, shedding light on its past in the ancient Mesopotamian epics, the Enum Elish and the Atrahasis, and later continuing its story in the Great Flood of the Sumerian tale, the Gilgamesh, which informs the story of Noah. Many historians find the story of Adam and Eve was a Yahwistic response to the exile in Babylon, the Torah being redacted at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah in the 6th century BCE. It appropriates, rewrites, and ethicizes the creation myths to which the Jewish people return and to which they were exposed. The warrior creator Marduk, who in his own grandmother Tiamat and her chaos monsters rise up against him. The salt ocean deep, who was primordial and never created, splits her in half to create the heavens and the earth. And out of the god Kingu, who incited grandmother to riot, Marduk creates human beings, Lulu, to be slaves to the gods. The Adam and Eve story, on the other hand, has one sovereign God who broods upon the face of the deep, Tohu Vevohu, who, after creating all the other living things in the sea and on earth, as Lyle actually noted, makes the first pair of human beings in his own image, Tselem Elohim, troubling plural as that remains in the text, male and female together in the first creation, Adam from the earth, and the woman whom he will name Eve, life in the second. They're given dominion over the creatures. Adam's tasked with naming them. They're prohibited only from eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for they will die. The serpent tells Eve that they will not die, but instead become like God, knowing good and evil. And in the heartbreaking sequence that follows, including all the terrible punishments of the pair, God's preoccupations become clear. He says to himself, after his terrible litany, "See, the man has become like us, knowing good and evil, and now he might also take his hand out from the tree. He might also take out his hand and stretch it to the tree of life and eat and live forever." Greenblatt argues that Genesis as a whole, and in particular the Adam and Eve story, is one that gives us an etiology of all that afflicts us: creation and innocence, loss of temptation, wrong choices, shame, sexual desire, labor, death, and most tragically of all, deep alienation between Creator and his created beings. Durkheim or Foucault might call it a reflection of social engineering, created from the remains of ancient Near Eastern stories and now patrolling the boundaries of the social realities that mattered to the royal state of Israel. He gives us not only the past of the story, where following recur in the myth of anteriority, there is no real beginning. I would argue that Adam and Eve of Genesis do in fact have parents. They're just camouflaged in the narrative. Tiamat lives on in Techom in Genesis 1. She's not created, she's simply there at the beginning, the deep. And the shadow of Marduk is clearly seen in God the Creator, who separates the heavens and the earth, who orders the lights of heaven, who makes man from the earth and breathes life into him. As Greenblatt says, this is a story in which innocent turns into wickedness in a flash without any fair chance for moral development. Unlike its predecessors, it offers an etiology of creation and what he calls so brilliantly a reversal of stories such as Gilgamesh, where clothing means belonging, where strife, love, and encounter with death and the struggle over immortality lead to a restored, not a lost kingdom, and to wisdom. Genesis turns this upside down and, quote, rewrites initiation as transgression. And it is hard in that powerful ritual phrase in this book not to hear an echo of the childhood story that he is brave enough to share with us. Looking up, defying the prohibition during the blessing of the Kohanim, during the Jewish liturgy, because God would be seen, because that would be death, instant death. And Professor Greenblatt shares that he sees, when he dares look up and is willing to sacrifice, that he sees not God passing overhead, but also only empty air and gossiping adults. And he writes, "I had been lied to." For him, transgression was initiation into this question. Now, let us think about the word story versus the word myth. Story recurs far more often in this book than the word myth, but myth means something different than story. Muo in the Greek, or muosai, means I tell in a special way. It is cognate with the word mystery. A myth is a sacred history, a tale of origins with moral force, but often involving, in fact always involving, supernatural creatures. It has no normal moral parameters. It is neither true nor untrue, right nor wrong, in the sense that we normally mean these terms. Creation stories exist because of the human commitment to causality, Aristotelian or otherwise. They almost always involve separating, differentiating, and demarcating. Chaos is almost always replaced by order. Ancient peace is almost always ruptured. Paradisical gardens are almost always lost. Ancient unending intercourse is almost always disturbed. The fire is almost always stolen and given to whom it should not be, or else that gift is eternally contested. The angels protest and are incinerated. Iblis protests and is cast out of heaven. Something is broken, something is stolen, and try as we might to restore it or replace it, it is not accomplished. So the creation story of Genesis can and should, I would argue, be studied alongside other creation stories from the world's history, myths paradoxical, in some ways beyond ethics. In many, there's one creator god, or there's two, as in the case of Izanagi and Izanami, the divine couple, brother and sister, who draw up the Japanese islands from the bottom of the sea. In the Yoruba tradition, winged beasts sent by Obatala scratch the earth into existence. Earth diver pulls it up from the bottom of the sea in Native American mythologies, or the gods create it with primal sacrifice from an egg or a primal person, as in Indo-European mythemes. There can be many creator gods, as in the case of the Mayan Popol Vuh, sovereign plumed serpent along with heart of lake and heart of sky, at a time when only the sea is pooled under all the sky. There is nothing whatever gathered under. Despite differences, which all of these tales almost always involve, as I said, creation of order from chaos, a kind of differentiation. And here we enter into the question, why make people? In the Popol Vuh, the gods say, how should the sowing be and the dawning? Who is to be the provider, the nurturer? Let this be this way, think about it. The earth should be removed, the water should be removed, emptied out for the formation of the earth-sown plate. And then comes the sowing and the dawning of sky earth. But there will be no high days and no bright praise for our work, our design, until the rise of the human work, the human design. Maker, modeler, begetter of the Mayans, create humans to sow the land, as Marduk does. Although in a gentler way, God takes multiple tries, unlike the God of Genesis. Human generations are mud, wood, and finely maize people, the final draft. Yggdrasil, reversing the Genesis story, hides the primal couple, Lif and Lifrasir, life and life's partner, after all of the gods and the whole world are destroyed. The Pacific Northwest trickster figure, the raven, creates people on the beach just because he's bored. Often we hear that God needs laborers, but they also need company. They need a way to be known and understood, to be mirrored. Ibn Arabi writes in the Fusus, I was a hidden treasure, and I yearned to be known in God's name. Another feature of creation epics, and I don't have time to go into this, is the notion of alienation of God, the God who is removed or removes himself. And we find this not only in Africa, but in many other myths of creation, including this one. Just to give one example, among the Krachi people in Togo, Wulbari ends up removing himself from a very intimate space with humans because people keep hitting him with their pestles when they grind. The smoke of the cooking fires gets into his eyes. And worst of all, an old woman, anxious to make a good soup, used to cut off a bit of him at each mealtime. And God, being pained at this treatment, went higher. So there is a way in which the loss of intimacy and God's loneliness at the exile figures as well into the sadness and the sorrow and the disruption, although the book does not dwell on that. In conclusion, I would argue that theologically, the notion that we have to choose between a story of randomness and lost rivulets of dead-end evolution on the way to the sea, of traits only inherited because they are envelopes of DNA, to be more likely to be passed on to other envelopes of DNA, and so that they will not be annihilated, versus a fairy tale of primal parents and talking snakes, with a gardener god who builds a booby trap for them, is perhaps a false dichotomy. And I wish The Rise and Fall of Adam and Eve, this brilliant book, did not cleave so closely to it. Myth often encodes or responds to history. It is not necessarily a story told apart from historical experience. Plato's cave, as it turns out, as I discovered to my shock in Greece, ends up being an actual cave, and it exactly resembles the one as mentioned in the Republic. Plato played there as a child, for example. There is evidence of an enormous flood. Geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman worked on it for 30 years. It happened around 5600 BC in the Black Sea. It involved the collapse of an earthen dam in the Bosphorus. They called their book Noah's Flood and thereby set off, I would argue, its dismissal, which is unfortunate, because it could be that the many flood myths do carry at least some trace of historical memory of it. And perhaps we could flip that notion and we could say that why should we not think of evolution not as a story or a parallel story, but but as a myth with all of the paradox and wonder, with all of the strangeness and beauty that the story of Adam and Eve holds. A story told in a special way. Surely a story that can be manipulated to evil ends, just as Adam and Eve can be, as Stephen notes, the eugenics movement, the randomness, a causal randomness, bringing with it its own form of despair, such as perhaps Darwin experienced. From the standpoint of sheer evolutionary biology, we human beings are actually a predatory invasive species that's radically dominated our environmental niche. But that means that religion and storytelling and myth-making and meaning-making is as much a part of evolution as anything else that we readily identify with it, as much as stasis and sudden replacement. So, turning the tables, we delude ourselves if we see scientific inquiry and knowledge as not a story, and by which I mean not a sacred history. Perhaps this was Stephen Jay Gould's insight. Perhaps we do live in a magical universe in which time can bend, the trees in a forest can communicate with one another, where my parakeet has an ancestor in massive dinosaurs 120 million years ago, where those same dinosaurs turn out to have had feathers and could sing, a magical universe where dung beetles known as scarabs turn to use the stars to navigate their perfectly straight routes across the desert at night, so that when their little heads are covered, they run in crazy zigzags. Where the Neanderthal versus Lucy, the Neanderthal is my direct ancestor, 4%. Where giraffes turn out to have a form of communicative language, it was just pitched too high for us to be able to detect it until recently. Where creatures living near sulfurous vents 7 miles below the Earth's surface can thrive in pressure that would make a human head explode. Where the coelacanth that was supposed to have gone extinct 30 million years ago turns up in a fish market in Sulawesi. Where chimpanzees dance before a waterfall in Tanzania, when it rains and rabbits kick their feet in the air when they leap for no reason, where invertebrates such as giant Pacific octopi show individual personality traits and facial recognition. A magical universe where pregnant mothers and their fetuses swap entire populations of cells across the placental barrier, osmotic as it turns out, and those cells, called microchimera, little monsters, stay swapped and subdividing so that none of us is a hermetically sealed individual, and Homo sapiens mothers and their children represent an unbroken enchainment all the way back, not to 4 female individuals who lived between 160,000 and 200,000 years ago, as was believed in the 1980s, but has now been shown to be only one, living almost certainly in what is now Ethiopia. Is this fiction at its most fictional, a story that revels in the delights of make-believe? This is perhaps instead the random, purposeful, mystical world that we have inherited, the garden that we are trying so hard to exile ourselves from. And as we know, geneticists have given our common grandmother a name, mitochondrial Eve. Stephen Greenblatt's beautiful book shows that perhaps they could not help themselves. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Kimberly. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Homo. It's great to see an attempt to bring humanities and scientists together. I'm meant to be a scientist. So I haven't had time to read all of Stephen's book. So in order to do some research for this, I did what all of us would do, turn to the web. And if you look up Adam and Eve on the web, then you find yourself looking at a page all about sex toys. So I went back to Nature. Nature Communications this week had a paper published about hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers is a very sad story, of course, because we come from hunter-gatherers, and hunter-gatherers living in the wild in the way that our ancestors once did. We are in the generation that is seeing the end of that. We're losing that tie to our evolutionary past. But people are quickly getting data where they can on people living as close to a real hunter-gatherer life as possible. And there were 18 groups in the Philippines of Agta who were studied for storytelling. And the stories they tell seem to me to resonate exactly with what we're hearing about with Adam and Eve. They are mythic in all sorts of ways. And in fact, in this particular study, what they were able to show is that among 18 different camps, they varied in the quality of the storytellers as rated by other people. They looked at 200 or 300 people. And it turns out that the better storytellers have camps in which there is more cooperation, as measured with economic gains. And by the way, the better storytellers have more children. They benefit themselves. And the stories they tell are like Kimberly was saying and Stephen was saying, they kind of bring social order. They tell stories of hierarchy and organization and division and indeed cooperation. So when we find that 56% of people in the United States believe that Adam and Eve were real people, and that 44% of them believe so with strong or absolute certainty, then that to me is something about the way that people organize themselves to cooperate in terms of their shared belief in something that is incredible. Well, I'm a scientist. Scientists tell stories. Kimberly was trying to suggest that we tell equivalent kinds of stories. I think in some ways they are equivalent because they are beautiful and creative. But I think in other ways they're not equivalent because I don't think they have the same social function. They have different social functions. I don't think they serve to help bring people together around a specific kind of shared belief, only about the belief that science matters. And I'll just draw attention to two ways in which we can tie the Adam and Eve story to science. One is the genetics. So just building on what Kimberly was saying, actually, in 1987, Rebecca Kahn used the fact that mitochondria have very little recombination. They're in all our cells, and the occasional mutation happens, and we can work out the mutation rates, and you can work out when it was that you have the last individual who was the common ancestor for everybody living on the Earth today. And what Kahn did in 1987 was say it's about 200,000 years, and now the estimate is 150 to 200,000 years ago. And I'll add to that by looking at Adam. So mitochondria pass through the maternal lines, and then you have the Y chromosome pass down the paternal lines. And they only very rarely have any crossing over with the matching X chromosome. So again, there are some uncertainties in the calculations, but the last Adam who gave rise to all the people living today, it was estimated to be between 200 and 300,000 years ago. So whether or not Eve actually met Adam is unclear. Whether or not they lived at the same time is unclear. They might have lived as much as 150,000 years apart. So we have to just adjust the story just a little bit. So that's the genetic angle. Let me just mention briefly about the social behavior angle. Stephen mentioned about Adam and Eve being a story among many different things, but partly it is about bonding. And the fact that there is only one Eve and one Adam pushes one in the direction of thinking it's about monogamy, which it seems very strange because the ancient Israelites were certainly not monogamous. But it can be said to be about pair bonding, and then that fits with what the Israelites were like. But still, just to think about monogamy just very briefly, and one could really say the same thing about bonding, bonding in general. It's not very common in the primates as a whole. Most of the primates have a much more liberal attitude, a sort of Harvey Weinstein attitude to their sexual relationships. Something like 10% can be said to be monogamous, that sort of thing. If you survey human societies, then monogamy is common within the societies, but rare between societies. That is to say, there are the great majority of human societies, 75, 80%, that sort of thing, are polygynous in the sense that they welcome polygyny, they allow it, but most people, in fact, end up monogamously married. Now, there is a difference between the bonding that you see in humans and the bonding that you see in non-human primates, which is due to the way that they move about. In the monogamous primates, they travel together all the time, the male and the female. It's like what happens after you retire. I'll leave you to get the implications of that, but the reason appears to be that when a primate male bonds with a primate female, he does not trust what she is up to unless he is with her. He has to guard her as a mate. So now then think about humans. If you look at any hunter-gatherer population in the world, or any population of humans anywhere in the world, regardless of their subsistence type, males and females do not spend all their time together, especially in their reproductive years. The women go one way, and the men go another if you're in hunter-gatherer society. And then they come together in the evenings. In fact, they spend very little time together. It's very difficult to find a photograph of a male and a female hunter-gatherer who are married to each other being together. You only do it by asking them, please, will you sit together? And they say, what? That's crazy. So in order to have a mate-guarding relationship, how do humans do it? The answer is we do it through language. We have gossip that allows us to check what each of you were doing during the day. And so there's lots of evidence that that's what's happening. So if you're going to think about the evolution of human bonding, you have to think about mate guarding, and you have to think about language. Well, for my own part, I will take a view on language, but different people might take different views. But for various reasons, I'm impressed with the evidence that language is the key to understanding the evolution of Homo sapiens. Thanks to a paper published last year, the date of the evolution of Homo sapiens has been pushed back from 170,000 years ago to 315,000 years ago in Morocco. And you never find literally the earliest thing, so probably it's a little bit earlier than that. And if language indeed emerged then that would be the time when, for the first time, humans were able to mate guard. They could not do so before, I think, because we know what the toddlers looked like. We know enough about locomotor mechanics to know that the toddlers were walking extremely slowly and basically had to be kept in camp. And that means that the women and the men really had to be doing something different. It's not like the non-human primates where a male and a female gibbon can swing cheerfully from tree to tree together and their baby comes with them. So the story that I want to convey from the evolutionary anthropology perspective is that if we think about Adam and Eve from the point of view of bonding, then there is a convergence with the notion of story, because the language that emerged enabling people to check what each other were doing during a day is the same language that would have produced the stories that were told around the campfire from at least 300,000 years ago, stories that would have included hunter-gatherer equivalents of Adam and Eve. Thank you.
Many thanks to Homi and to Stephen for including me in this occasion, and to Kimberly and Richard for your beautiful papers. In the final paragraph of On the Origin of Species, Charles Darwin guides the reader in an exercise on how to look at nature through the eyes of evolutionary theory. It's interesting, he suggests with characteristic mildness, to contemplate an entangled bank, clothed with many plants of many kinds, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects flitting about, and with worms crawling through the earth, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms, so different from each other, and dependent on each other in so complex a manner, have all been produced by laws acting around us. Though Darwin's words share with Invocations of Eden their imagery of proliferation, of an exhaustive and teeming roster of all that lives, this is no deliberately staged garden. Divine law is nowhere in evidence. The blind and soulless actors Darwin goes on to name are, and these are all capitalized in his text, growth and reproduction, inheritance, variability, the struggle for life, and natural selection, leading not only to divergence of character or speciation, but to extinction. This is a story that extinguishes as much as it creates. There exists an eerie similarity between Darwin's language here and the words chosen by Stephen Greenblatt to describe the experience of visiting a paleoanthropology lab and contemplating the dizzying non-linearity of fossil evidence for hominin evolution. It is difficult to find the story in a tangled bush, he writes, playing on the branching tree-like structures that evolutionary thinkers use to illustrate relationships of ancestry and descent among species. The narrative of human evolution looks from this perspective less like an act of creation or a march of progress than, quote, a wilderness of discontinuous and crisscrossing tracks, end quote. Despite the confidence with which Darwin imbues his final paragraph, the idea that a properly attuned act of looking will yield the truth of the evolutionary story, Stephen identifies an unavoidable feature of Darwin's theory as it applies to human origins. Quote, that this account happens to be true according to our best scientific lights does not in itself make it good to think with. On the contrary, its difficulty, its uncertainties, its resistance to narrative coherence makes it one of the great challenges of our age, end quote. Although Darwin himself did not address human origins in print until 1871, other 19th century thinkers were eager to work through evolutionary theory's human implications. They began to ask another of Stephen's central questions, one that Renaissance artists took up with particular passion. What were the first people like? While naturalists like Thomas Huxley drew their favorite evidence from the anatomical and embryological similarities between humans and other primates, cultural evolutionists began to think through what the earliest humans were like using a different source. Ethnographic reports, their own and those of others, and this is a pretty heterogeneous group of documents, on the lifeways of small-scale societies. The words I just used, lifeways and small-scale societies, would have been neither familiar nor coherent to a 19th century thinker. Instead, those thinkers described the conditions of those outside the ambit of Western Europe and its cultural offshoots, or the lower races of man, with taxonomic gradations including savagery and barbarism. These labels were as technical in anthropology as lunatic and idiot were in late 19th century English law. Lewis Henry Morgan explains in Ancient Society that they serve to classify both peoples and time periods according to modes of subsistence, technological innovations, geographic distribution, and degree of literacy. The overlap of social and temporal categories is crucial here. It underlines a cornerstone of cultural evolutionary logic. Small-scale societies are atavisms, living examples of earlier stages through which civilized 19th century populations once passed. And we see what can sometimes be a complicated echo of this, though much updated in contemporary evolutionary anthropology's engagement with hunter-gatherer societies. In The Sciences of Law and Society, John Ferguson McLennan wrote, "Old means not old in chronology, but in structure. That is most archaic which lies nearest to the beginning of human progress considered as a development, and that is most modern which is farthest removed from that beginning." Subsistence strategies, technologies, and language capabilities, that is, could be arranged in a hierarchy from primitive to complex. The developmental sequence of any given society would be charted as a journey up that hierarchy. There was, however, a problem. Morgan admitted in his Taxonomy of Human Development that there existed no human population in the late 19th century that persisted in the most primitive human state, known as the lower status of savagery, in which humans first used fire and began to speak, but had not yet invented the bow and arrow. So perhaps something of what Richard is imagining with the first Adam and Eve. Conjuring this period, quote, the infancy of the human race, end quote, Therefore, it required an act of imagination, the generation of a coherent narrative. A strategy adopted by several prominent cultural evolutionists, including Morgan, relied on a form of deep reading. Human rituals and words, they claimed, move along a trajectory from the literal to the symbolic. The more civilized we become, the more distant are our cultural practices and words from the utterly concrete form in which they originated. A father used not to walk his daughter down the aisle in a gesture emblematic of the end of her childhood and the beginning of sociological maturity. He literally gave her away, though probably in exchange for something of value from the family of his future son-in-law. A groom did not carry his bride over the threshold of their new home for reasons of romance. He had to bind her in his arms because he had captured her from her tribe and she might run away. It was even easier to infer the earliest human version of a practice from a more primitive society, one closer to the source. Morgan and colleagues, including Sir John Lubbock, took their methods a step further. Not only did the kinship arrangements and marriage practices of savages and barbarians provide a window into human prehistory, but they proposed, contained in the terms of kinship themselves, in the words people used to describe their relationships to one another, the keen observer could find the key to primordial human social structures. Europeans use a form of kinship terminology that they labeled descriptive, in which terms like aunt, grandfather, stepmother, and son-in-law give precise information about the nature and degree of connection between parties. But compared to Mandarin, from what I understand, Romance and Germanic languages are actually pretty generalized. For example, we use the word aunt to describe our mother's sisters, our father's sisters, and the wives of our mother's brothers on both sides. So it's descriptive only to a point. But at the other extreme, small-scale societies that Morgan and others encountered employed much more inclusive terminology, and they called this not descriptive, but classificatory. The same word might be used to identify a man's wife, his wife's sister, his brother's wife, and his wife's brother's wife. So these are all kind of the same kinship term. At the most inclusive level, the only kinship terms recognized would translate as mother, father, wife, husband, son, and daughter. Vertical generational differences and differences of sex were the only ones preserved by these terms. If rituals of gift-giving, marriage, and diplomacy were distant echoes of literal enactments, then the language of kinship surely symbolized the actual relationships it originated to describe. In the earliest days of classificatory kinship terms and societies, Lubbock claimed, all the men and women of a single generation not only called one another wife and husband, but in fact behaved as wife and husband to one another, participating in what he delicately called promiscuous marriage. Paternity would have been unknown, and maternity inconsequential, because the children belonged to the tribe. Lubbock's version of early society, titillatingly foreign to the sexual mores of his readership, reinforced the narrative of amorality and backwardsness among largely brown-skinned people that helped to justify British colonial projects. When Darwin came at last to write about human origins in The Descent of Man and Selection in relation to sex, much of his book did not concern humans at all. The vast catalog of evidence for sexual selection in insects, fish, birds, and mammals is bookended by two discussions of Homo sapiens. The first establishes human antiquity and biological continuity with other species, and the second, which occurs at the end, takes the differences in physical appearance among human populations as evidence for sexual selection. Different people find different things attractive, and this has resulted in population differentiation. To make the case for sexual selection in humans, Darwin engages the theories of prehistoric marriage and kinship articulated by Morgan, McLennan, and Lubbock. He treats them respectfully, but in the event, he disagrees with them. Perhaps because his own experiences, which Stephen describes, of savages from Tierra del Fuego did not include evidence of promiscuity, or perhaps because the idea that early humans mated indiscriminately was for Darwin an ethical bridge too far, to go back to the ethical resonances of these stories, he turned to what he knew of non-human primates. Close-range, longitudinal field studies of primate behavior of the kind that Richard conducts were still a century away. So Darwin had very limited evidence to work with. And drawing on what he had, he concluded that male apes manifested the same kind of pair-bonded sexual jealousy and protectiveness of their young as did civilized modern European human men. So he's kind of projecting this image. Female primate sexuality thus was and always had been restrained. This story conferred for Darwin a form of narrative coherence. I want to close with an observation and then open discussion with a question for the panel. The observation is this. In both broadly Judeo-Christian and Western scientific imaginings of human origins, the question of how our species came into being is closely linked with visions of our earliest reproductive arrangements. Whether we are made of dirt in the image of the divine or descended from clever arboreal knuckle walkers, our mating systems in these stories are governed by hierarchy and by rules. What do any of our panelists think drives this particular fascination? Are we merely describing the inevitable? Is this a descriptive act? Or are we grappling with something that, as Claude Lévi-Strauss claimed about incest, has to be regulated, has to be narrativized, because instinct unbounded would threaten a fundamental tenet of human society? So in shorter terms, are these stories we have to tell? Thank you.
Well, I can perhaps just start by responding, first of all, thanking the three of you again, and responding to Meredith's last question by resuming a conversation I had very, very briefly with Richard. As far as, and I'm sure I'll get all of this wrong, as far as I know, what happens to early humans is, to mark early humans as bipedalism. We come down from the trees and start walking on two legs. We stop knuckle walking. And that seems to be associated with also reduction in the size of canines. Yes, that our canines, we have them, but they're much smaller than those of our primate cousins. And I said, rather rashly, that it must be, to pick up Meredith's point, that somehow the reduction of canines must be a sign of a renegotiation of sexual relations, because the canines in chimpanzees and gorillas must be used in establishing male dominance. And then you said, no, I was completely wrong. So let's start there with, and then we can maybe figure out why, the deeper question that Meredith is asking, why we care about these, so much about these arrangements anyway in our origin stories.
Well, that's a great segue about what Australopithecines were doing. So what you're talking about is 3 or 4 million years ago. The genus Homo came out about 2 million years ago, and then 6 million years ago, we came from a chimpanzee-like ancestor, and you said we came down from the trees. I've got to, excuse me for this aside, but we didn't come down from the trees. What we did was to shift from quadrupedal walking in forests to bipedal walking in more savannas, but we still went up in the trees, and the chimps spend a lot of time on the ground right now. So there's no reason to think that we actually changed the amount of time we spent on the ground. The point, though, is that the Australopithecines, by the time you get to 3 or 4 million years ago, although not earlier, have got these very reduced canines. And as you say, absolutely rightly, they have been attributed to reduced fighting among males, which they associate with more monogamy. I gave my reasons a few minutes ago for why you wouldn't expect monogamy at that time. And the logic about the reduced teeth is now, I would say, predominantly referred to eating. And what's going on is that this shift into more open areas is associated with a change in the diet to things that you spend longer chewing, and that you need stronger muscles to be able to chew, and namely roots. Roots and tubers coming out of the ground. And if you look at carnivores or ungulates or primates, where they are doing more chewing, then the muscles come forward, the gape of the mouth is reduced, and therefore the weapons at the end of the mouth just get in the way. You can't afford long canines because you have a relatively narrow gape in order to be able to accommodate really effective chewing. So I would say that many people, I mean, I hesitate to speak for the whole discipline, but a popular view is that the reason for the reduction in those canines is to do with better chewing and not better fighting, or not reduced fighting.
So in terms of the Genesis account, it's God's words about being vegetarians and eating all of as many of the fruits except for one that really counts, and not the ecstatic sexual bond between the male and the female.
Well, you could say that. Of course, the ancestry of primates goes back a long way of eating stuff, but this is eating roots in particular that enforces the chewing. I wanted to challenge the premise, and I'm probably. I'm sure I'm wrong, but I know of a number of cosmological stories which do not involve mating.
Absolutely.
I wanted to draw attention to the fact that a lot of them seem to me to refer to relationships between men and women of dominance, as was being discussed earlier. And that seems to me to be really fascinating. And Kimberly, you drew attention to this, that it's slightly puzzling in a world in which men always are dominant. Why do you need stories to reinforce that?
Oh, that was Richard. That was
is it Stephen? Sorry.
Stephen's
Yeah.
concern. Yeah, and I agree, Richard. The creation stories always reflect the preoccupations of the society telling them. And when we say that, we need to be not overly sociological, because the relationships between human beings and supernatural beings is, I would argue, usually the most important. We tend to, because we live in the age we do, tend to be extremely anthropocentric, but that does not mean that these stories were. Negotiating relationships with the powers that live us, that we pretend to understand, as Auden said, was the central concern. So one of the sadness, the breakages that occurs in the Genesis story that Stephen doesn't dwell on is God remaining in the garden. God is lonely. He remains there. And what's interesting is that the Jewish mystical tradition argues that part of God actually gets split off. The Lois Sifra, the Shekhinah, the feminine part of God, actually goes into exile with Adam and Eve, weeps with them, is cut off from the rest of God. And so you end up with this yearning for reunion and return. And that is what ends up in the temple between the Kruvim, between the cherubim of the Holy of Holies. And that is what goes into exile when the temple itself is destroyed and ends up being incarnate as the Sabbath queen at Shabbat. So, God himself is left lonely as well. But anyway, the negotiation of human relationships with invisible powers. If we're thinking about the Paleolithic or Neolithic period, we have to include the dead, who are metaphysical, who are much more powerful than living. That relationship has to be negotiated. And what's interesting, for example, I was working at Çatalhöyük for 3 different seasons, working with archaeologists there, is the way that ends up getting literalized too. The dead have to be under the floor or you can't build a house. There has to be a dead baby in the southwest corner of the house or it will not, you can't build it. And so for...
You're talking about nowadays?
No. This is to 9,000 years ago.
Okay,
Yeah, exactly. So the dead,
to be clear.
the dead, we tend to think of the dead as different from the gods, but we shouldn't. In most societies, the dead are powerful metaphysical beings. In fact, they may have been, the source of later theologies that are more developed. So I would agree, not all cosmogonies are interested in patrolling sex or reproduction. Many of them have other concerns.
Well, I mean, I'm aware of this from reading some of the hunter-gatherer literature, where you often find this story of why it is that men end up controlling women, and you get the perspective that it's an endlessly used justification, and the idea that seems to me to sort of be appealing here is that in the public arena, it's clear that men are dominant to women. But in the private arena, it's not. In other words, within a husband-wife relationship, then either the man or the woman might be socially dominant to the other.
Right.
But it's not true in the public arena. And so these stories enable the men to appeal to a wisdom that is agreed in the public level.
That's patriarchal.
To justify their patriarchy within the home.
It's so interesting you say that because, for example, at Çatalhöyük, the anthropologists were so startled to discover that men and women have the same amount of stress in their bones, the same amount of weight bearing, that the labor was, in fact, equally divided. And I'm not saying it was a proto-egalitarian society, but that was very surprising. Yeah. They're also surprised to discover that the skeletons that are routinely buried under the floors of the houses, up to 30 in some cases, this was a shocker, through dental phenotyping, were not related to one another.
Oh.
So again, back to Meredith's notion of the way that family and kinship groups can be very differently culturally appropriated and distributed depending on where we are in the world.
It sounds like in house societies, there's been recent evidence from what I understand in hunter-gatherer societies even that ritual or fictive kinship can be as binding in the way that people distribute time and energy and resources as genetic forms of kinship.
Exactly, and childbearing, and not childbearing, but child rearing perhaps, and food distribution, and all of it. Yeah.
I want to ask to put a little pressure, and this is partly a response to Kimberly's calling me out as the village atheist, which I suppose I am, because it's true that the reason I think you're right in observing that in my case I spend too little time thinking about the strange haunting quality of the Adam and Eve hearing the voice of God in the garden and then hiding themselves. So it's not that God is withdrawing from them, but they're now in a position of hiding. But it has to do with my difficulty, I think, grappling with what to do with the belief in the God that I think can't fit in our, but Richard may correct me, in our account of our current scientific account of human origins. It is possible that you could construct a narrative in which, in some part of your, how shall we say, life frame, you can acknowledge the existence of a God. I don't know how, but I imagine you can, but not in the evolutionary story. If I understand the evolutionary story, there isn't a way in which the creature who is described in this and in so many other in various forms, and so many of the other of the origin stories, there's no equivalent figure. I take it that was the whole force of the scientific effort of the late 18th and 19th century, to try to get that figure out of the origin story.
Well, that's a funny way of reading Darwin, isn't it? Because I thought Darwin's point was that he found it rather agonizing that you had to give up God in order to understand the way that evolution worked.
I don't mean it was done gleefully or easily, but that it was part of the it was built into.
It was a
the
consequence,
right? It was a sort of perhaps unintended consequence, and an interesting moment happens. So Darwin is in correspondence with Asa Gray, who is a really famous biologist actually here at Harvard, and Asa Gray is also a committed theist. And Darwin's disappointed. He finds himself disappointed to see how hard Asa Gray is working to try to reconcile evolutionary accounts with some role for God. And so he does, I think, what a lot of people with faith and also who believe in evolution do, which is he kind of defers God's role further and further back in the process. A kind of a
watchmaker.
A watchmaker, but also his original take was that it was God who put the favorable variations in there among all the not so favorable ones. And Darwin's getting these letters from Asa Gray, and who he loves dearly, and who has been his defender here, and who's been baiting Louis Agassiz like it's his job. And Darwin's just reading these letters saying, oh my God. And I think that for him is actually a moment when he sees how disappointed he is in Gray trying to fit God in there, when he really has to come face to face with how, for him at least personally, there isn't a space for God in this narrative. And this is in his relationship with his wife, Emma, a kind of a big deal. There are 2 points in their relationship when she writes him letters because she's so agonized. One is right after they get married and they've moved to London, and she's kind of hoping for rounds of theater and visitors, and Darwin is hoping for quiet time in his study, and so they have all these kind of newlywed figuring it out moments. And in the midst of this, she's also realizing how much more committed she is to faith than he is, and so she writes him a very gentle but really heart-wrenching letter about the goodness in him and hoping that he'll be able to come to a place of reconciliation with God. And she doesn't do it again until after The Origin of Species has been published. And she's starting to see the consequences. And they've lost a couple of their beloved children, and she has really needed God to get her through that. And he is walking farther and farther away. So that's kind of the site of their second moment of reckoning on that.
What I take to be Kimberly's response in your beautiful presentation to this is in effect what was Lucretius's response, which is to, you don't have to give up wonder, you don't have to give up the sense of the marvelous in the world. If you just have to give up the idea that there's a metaphysical order that's creating all of this, moving the pieces around, rewarding and punishing.
I think, Stephen, and I don't in any way intend to fudge the answer, but I think all of us, and I include myself, are to some degree held hostage to the notion of God as a really great uncle. And I even found it in your book, that he's kind, that he's merciful, that he's just. He's not those things. He's not even those things in the Hebrew Bible. He's fighting between his mercy and his justice. He prays that his mercy may overcome his justice and all his other attributes in the Talmud. The Hebrew Bible is full of his arbitrary cruelty, his might, endless creative energy. John Levinson has argued that he never really overcomes chaos and has to fight it to the end of time. So he's sort of, I think beyond some of the categories that tend to emerge. I think the thing that gets us hung up is the notion of intentionality, right? That we see these wonderful and beautiful and amazing things that continually confound us with their awe-inspiring dimensions in science, including some of the terrible things that science reveals to us through research. And we think that can't be intentional. But my point is, myth is not about rational metaphysical involvement in the world on God's part. It's not about intentionality. It's always paradoxical. It's always impossible to understand. But the great mysteries in human experience are also. So I don't think we can. I don't think that the split between rationality and irrationality that comes through in the book, or fantasy, shall we say, is really the level that we want to stop. That was my only point.
No, I take it. I think I understand. In relation to where we are now, and I don't think I resolved this at all in the book. I think I can't resolve it. I think one key question about origin stories is who gets to tell them.
Right.
We haven't resolved that struggle now in our classrooms, in our schools. We're actually in some ways still having key arguments about this that have real consequences and stakes. So my goal in the book is not to. I wouldn't have bothered to write a book about the story of Adam and Eve if I just thought it was something that didn't count and should be brushed aside. I think it's incredibly powerful and beautiful. I want it to be powerful and beautiful as a work of literature, not as a story, an origin story that somehow has a place at the table with the origin story that Richard and Meredith are trying to tell.
Yeah, but we know that when speaking to people about the myths that animate them, that give meaning to their lives, and I include myself and all of us, we all have them, whatever they are, that the presentation of facts, quote unquote, is not the way to combat them. And why do they have to be combated? In other words, what is getting us so animated and so angry at this point, for example, in our country's history? Do we really need to fight the story of Adam and Eve with creation? Are these two antagonistic? I wonder. Even without a kind of violent synthesis, does it need to be violent? I'm not sure. But I do know that sitting at Harvard and throwing up our hands and say, can you believe that 46% or 50% of the country actually believes this story, is not bringing us into more of a conversation. It's pulling us apart. And perhaps that is the wrong question. Perhaps the battle is not pitched in that way. Perhaps it's not a battle. That's my only point, I think.
And I teach some of that percent at UMass Boston, and this is something I'm curious if any of the rest of you have encountered in your pedagogy. I teach the Introduction to Human Evolution in our Anthropology department, and every semester at least one student, whether privately on a beginning of semester questionnaire or publicly, sometimes in front of the entire class, asks me a question about either how their faith fits, or sometimes the terms are really stark. Well, what about Jesus? Is a question that has been posed to me once 2 minutes before class. And so I was kind of scribbling on the board. And my instinct has been to try to not be antagonistic, to try to create a space and to... One story I told was about when different kinds of evidence become available and how we work with the evidence that we have in any given moment. But that, I think, is unsatisfying to people for whom particular forms of evidence don't really carry water, or perhaps they carry the water only so far, and then like leaky baskets, it all leaks out. So this is something that I'm still very much grappling with in a practical way, because there seems something sacred to identity in those professions of faith that one does not wish to denigrate.
Yeah, and my only point is that faith also interacts with history and historicity in ways that we're still kind of, So, on our side, the fact that last week it was revealed that the Crusader tomb at the Holy Sepulchre was, in fact, removed to reveal a 4th century covering, as Eusebius had described it. Underneath there was a Jewish tomb with a shelf in it. And the response, if one is discussing that, which doesn't mean that the resurrection is true or untrue, it just means that that was what was found. So there's more historicity to the oral and other written accounts than we had thought. That is met here generally with an eye roll. That's still evidence. It doesn't mean it's evidence of the resurrection, but it does mean that there's more historicity to the faith accounts than we had suspected. And so it would be good to see these things in conversation. I was thinking about Richard's points about the ways that paradigms can be destabilized. There's a site at Göbekli Tepe which has been excavated. It's 11,000 years old. It consists, Heinrich Schmidt excavated it, one of many tepes, but he actually dug into it about 15 or 20 years ago and discovered that it contained 18 concentric layers of enormous stone circles with anthropomorphic and theriomorphic figures on it. These are 20 feet high. They're megaliths. They were extremely difficult to build. We know from incisions in the rocks around that they were made and carried great lengths. The only problem is that they were made by hunter-gatherers and set up at enormous cost and effort, which upends the Marxist narrative that you have to have subsistence and at least some mode of security and guarantee of food and freedom from attack before you can have religion. And this upended that narrative. So it doesn't mean that religion's true or science is true. It just means we have got to think about it in more complicated ways.
I want to just allow people to pose questions, and I'm going to start with Homi, and then we'll ask you to pose your questions.
So thank you very much. I found this to be so engaging because it is such an intersective conversation with convergences and departures in important ways. But one of the issues that I thought might be addressed across the panel, but found no direct engagement, is the question of desire. The question of desire, whether it is, and I think where I would root it would be in Kimberly's attack. Kimberly, hang on for a second. On intentionality.
Come in peace.
On intentionality, or the questioning of intentionality. And once you begin to question that, then I think in many ways the question of desire not simply reproductive or sexual, but the question of desire, the desire which starts in the Genesis story, the unboundedness, the uncontrolling ability, the disobedience, the temptation, the transgression. And in the Darwin account, this agonizing to keep God out, the agony of the text produces a kind of symptomatic desire. You have one kind or there's a symptom being written in there. And I just thought that this is a concept that, in terms of art, for instance, even the manufacture of materials to desire to move from what is real and may not be to realism, and creates that desire in the work itself. So I was just interested, maybe this question goes nowhere, leave it out, but I just kept thinking each of you in different ways, the notion of desire I wanted.
The one easy place to start is actually sidestepping, as we've done for a second, the question of reproductive desire, whether it is or isn't at the center of this origin story, is simply to quote a strange moment, the moment of truth, as it were, the key moment when the fruit is taken, the transgression happens. The lines in the King James translation, at least, are, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, so we have Richard, and that it was pleasant to the eyes. There you go. That it was pleasant to the eyes. That it was. So there's a extremely strange registering of its beauty.
No stickers, no little stickers on it.
But it's understood it's not only graspable, but that it's somehow visually satisfying.
It's beautiful. Aesthetic.
And a tree to be desired.
There you are.
A tree to be desired to make one wise, is the line. She took the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave it to her husband. So those three things that are linked here, that it was food, that it was visually satisfying,
beauty,
or exciting,
in a way.
beautiful, visually beautiful. That it was, and that it had some cognitive power, or to be desired.
So I think that's very interesting. But the point you made, Kimberly, which fascinated me, was the splitting of God. The female part goes
in Jewish mysticism.
Yeah, and then the male remains, and the longing, for desire in that respect. I could go on. I just find this fascinating, but I'm going to.
One place where I think desire is really interesting is another point that Kimberly made about, and this is something I'm really curious about, the absence of ethics, and almost a prescription for ethics not belonging in a space of myth, or at least not the kinds of normative ethics that we are engaged in. And so I was starting to wonder about this desire for ethics that we seem to have in both evolutionary and non-evolutionary narratives and origin stories.
It's not that there's no ethics, and I think Stephen's book makes a great case for some of the ethics that emerge from the tale of Adam and Eve. It's that at another level there is a place that I wouldn't say without ethics, but is beyond ethics. Okay, so the fruit is beautiful, and the woman desires it, but who put it there? God. God put it there, and it is especially beautiful because he made it that way. And then, as Stephen points out, told them not to eat it. So it's a booby-trapped fruit, and they do. And all sorrow breaks loose, and God himself, even if he is not the Sphirot in later Jewish mysticism, loses his, I would argue, his children, because I think he does carry Marduk with him, and I think, so forth. But he loses these creations, and he's left alone, walking in the garden. It's heartbreaking. The liturgies afterwards in Judaism and Christianity, and then when we find it in Iblis in Islamic tradition, are about yearning for reunion with God, how much they miss him. But if we look at some mystical writings, we find God yearning for humans, that he's very sad.
I see someone. Yeah, I think you have the microphone. You're passing it. There was someone in the back. So, okay, would you? And then here's someone here. You can give the microphone to afterwards. Please.
I have a question for Professor Wrangham. I'm just trying to work out how mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam could be alive at different times. So it seems to me that one solution, and the obvious one, but probably not the likely one, is that Eve was messing around. so that she would have had children with 4, 6, 8, who knows how many different men who would have carried on. Another one would be, no, mitochondrial Eve is the wrong person to look at. There was an Eve who had children with an Adam, and all her female descendants died out except for one line, 80,000 years later or something. Could you comment on whether Adam and Eve would have been alive at the same time?
Well, as I said, I mean, 100,000 years could separate them, but I don't think you have to point too much to mitochondrial Eve herself. Her daughters, her granddaughters, and so on. I mean, it just happened that the males with whom this lineage were producing babies were males who themselves were remarkably diverse in terms of their origins. They maybe happened because the females were moving around to different areas. It may be because the males were moving around. But there's nothing logical that says that the daughters, the granddaughters, and the subsequent descendants of Eve had to stick to any particular set of males that were associated with the time or location of mitochondrial Eve.
But wasn't it the male line with the Y chromosome Adam that was earlier?
Yes, it goes back earlier, exactly.
Possibly.
Well, yes.
Or it could intersect at one point. Right?
That's true, yes. I mean, there's still a range of error estimates on the dates.
It could at one point. There's just one point.
It is possible that they can be united. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'd like to ask about some ethical aspect of the Genesis story. So, as I know, the Adam and Eve suddenly recognized their shame on their being nude after eating their apple. So I'm wondering, is there such a shame on nudity? Being nude is common in all people, including the primitive types, and also is there such a story about the feeling shame on nudity in other myth or other religion? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think this is also a question that Stephen and Richard could speak to, but part of what was so upsetting to Europeans in the early modern era, and even to Darwin when he visited South America, was that he saw people with really different conceptions of shame from his own. He saw people who went about pretty much naked. So that form of shame was not, in fact, universal.
Right.
Yes.
So is there people feeling no shame with fully nude, or they have at least some minimal?
There are.
Well, yes,
I believe so.
I'm pretty darn sure.
Yes.
I'm racking my brain for photographs. It reminds me, this issue, of Shagnan's story about the Yanomamo.
Right.
In Venezuela,
right.
Where the men wear a string that is tied to the top of the penis, and it holds the penis up near to their waist. And a man would not be seen dead without his penis string, but it covers nothing. So it's totally symbolic.
And so what happens is, with missionary histories, particularly Christian missionary histories, is that, ideas of shame that are drawn from Genesis are then imposed on other peoples who have, as Richard said, very, very different cultural notions of dress, of shame, very different. And it becomes extremely difficult to understand those because they're coming out of this story. Yeah.
I mean, it's possible that. Oh, there's other questions. So let's pass the microphone around.
I almost hate to bring this up, but the story of Lilith. Would you pay any attention to that in your book? Or is that just so far afield?
I don't spend. I mentioned Lilith and discussed her briefly, but not a lot of time. But I think that I think it's a fantastically interesting story, precisely because it takes to a more extreme point the question of dominance and disobedience, The Lilith story, as you I'm sure know, is precisely about it's not biblical but about a possible, and there are many speculations about this, and rabbinical speculations about possible alternative or earlier attempts on God's part to do something. In this case, extra rabbinical. I mean, the possible creation of a female who refused to obey. And in this case gave up, was threatened with dire punishments, including the killing of her offspring, and nonetheless refused because she said she was made of the same or better stuff from Adam. The reason I don't talk about it, and partly not simply out of ignorance, but partly because what fascinated me is that the biblical story already, even though it has this enormously long history of misogyny associated with it, has the counter argument also built into it. That what surfaces in the Lilith story is already in the what looks like much more orthodox and conventional story of Eve. There are many people who say from very early on that Eve is the hero of the story, that the disobedience is correct, that Eve is superior to Adam because she was created out of flesh and not dirt, and because she was created in the garden and not out of the garden. And that is to say, one of the strange things to me fascinating things about the story, and it goes back to issues that Kimberly also raised, is that there's a kind of, perhaps this is, I don't think it's the mark of a difference between myth and literature, but I think it is the mark of what is interesting in both myth and literature, which is the possibility of an alternative interpretation built into what looks like a closed system. And the Adam and Eve story is astonishing to me because in a tiny compass, 50 or 75 verses, you have
all these interpretations,
violently alternative interpretations that are hidden inside, including Lilith, strangely enough, built into a story that looks like it's excluding her. Yeah, please.
I have a question about language. You brought up language, and in the passage that you mentioned, when Eve actually gets the apple, she desires the apple, she desires to know and to know beauty. We imagine that this happens through language. And yet, in the later iterations of the story, there was a huge question in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period whether the first word was actually uttered in paradise or outside. And Dante actually leaves it open. He says in the De Vulgari, he says the first word was uttered either inside or outside the paradise. So it's a very interesting, complicated question about the relationship between language and knowledge and beauty and aesthetics and desire, perhaps, also. And I wonder whether you could speak to that.
There is as you know, as well as I, there's an enormous history of painting in which no language, in which there are gestures, in which there in which all of this is acted out without language at all, but with bafflement, head scratching, or sexual temptation. A variety of things that don't necessarily involve language at all. It is the case that the tradition that thinks that the words existed already there are interpretations of the story that imagine that not only did Adam give the names to the animals and imagines it as linguistic giving, but also imagines that Adam had written already a great philosophical encyclopedia about the world, because one strong line of interpretation is that humans lost knowledge after humans once possessed more knowledge and lost it then, so that Adam must have had a much fuller linguistic capacity, and that this goes against precisely the alternative theory. I don't know I don't know enough about the alternative, the innumerable alternative origin stories to know if the issue of language comes up.
It does in interesting ways. One thing just to note is that the Jewish and the Christian and the Islamic cosmogonic story is not the only one where the gods create the earth through language. And so God this is what, Genesis is very startling in that way. God he sort of says the world into being. He speaks it into being. And this is the case in the Popol Vuh as well, the Mayan creation cosmogony. So the question of the primacy, of course, that's picked up with, and I think you mentioned this, with the Christian notion of the logos, the word that creates at the beginning of time. So we even see these interesting icons where you find Jesus Christ walking in the Garden of Eden as the logos, as God. I mean, that's a very common icon in the Orthodox tradition as well. But yeah, the role of language is not uniformly stressed or even mentioned in some cosmogonies. It's not. My point is, it's not seen as in all cosmogonies as the primary kind of crowning achievement of of creation or of human life. It's really interesting to work in a pre-literate dig, where there was no written history, but there had to have been language, and to know that histories were being told and shared, and yet not in a way that we could have access to through written records, but had to begin to infer through other forms of symbolic thought, like hand paintings and architectural arrangements and the use of wild animal parts inside houses and burials and so forth.
Is it believed, Richard, that chimpanzees possess some
Language?
something
No.
that approaches or
No. What chimpanzees do is a relatively sophisticated form of animal communication, but it doesn't have anything like the symbolic strength of humans. So you can bring chimpanzees up to use signs, hand signs, and they can end up using maybe a few hundred. They can combine them into 2 or 3 word chunks. But
tweet, in effect.
Sorry?
Like for a tweet.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, the original tweet. But it's still enormously simple. So if we're talking about language, I think that there's a very strong case that only Homo sapiens has had language, and that Neanderthals, for all of their cultural creativity in a number of ways, and they were able to do almost everything that Homo sapiens did, but they did it at incredibly low rates. And a predominant interpretation is that the big difference between sapiens and our Neanderthal companions was that they had no language. It's special to us.
Yes.
I'm over here. I wanted first to thank you for a fascinating discussion. I wanted to turn to the part of it where you were all commenting on the time period from Darwin after, where there's this sense of maybe disappointment or loss or difficulty in reconciling views of the past that have a God in them and views of the past that have science in them. And if you think of sort of 2 groups of people moving along different tracks and thinking about the tension between those groups that we sometimes see the results of now, but that doesn't necessarily have to be so, because there is an interpolation about our origin, but that can coexist, right? That difference in interpolation. It's where differences in extrapolation about what our origin implies, that seems to be the cause of more of the tension. So I'm wondering if any or all of you have thought about whether it's necessary that interpolating back leads to the results of extrapolating forward that appear to diverge, and create such problems for us.
Could you say more about, that's such a great way of putting it, could you say more about the issue of what it implies? How do you see it?
Well, one tends to think about, these days about legislation that seems to reflect strong religious beliefs, and those religious beliefs correlate with strong views about literalism in terms of, interpretation of religious texts. And so, to me, the tension of the 2 streams plays out in a vision of society that, at least on the edges of those things, seems to differ.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to split hairs, but I would say perhaps a certain strand of interpretation of religious texts. For example, the Quran says if God had wanted to make just one religion, he would have. There are many other strands within religious traditions that are, I don't want to use the word tolerant because it sounds like poison and I wish we'd get rid of it, but that are egalitarian, for example, or are more, not seeking to discriminate, to divide, to elevate, to be hierarchical, but the opposite. It's just, so I just wanted to make that point that we're talking about interpretive strands.
Right, and I didn't mean to imply.
No, I know you didn't. No, I know you didn't.
It's just where, the sense of can't we get people into a room and try and all get along? And we don't have to interpolate the same way. We can coexist believing very different things.
But
It's
apparently
when those
not.
Extrapolations.
But not though.
Yeah,
But
and-
so not. What is happening? No. And I love your question. Yeah.
And a part of me wonders, you referred to the time after Darwin, and even while Darwin himself was very retiring and really reticent about this, some of the proponents of his theory actually staged conflict. The really famous conversation between Thomas Huxley and Bishop Samuel Wilberforce at Oxford at the British Association for the Advancement of Science meeting, which is the one where Wilberforce said something like, on which side are you descended from a monkey? The whole monkey-human business was nowhere in Darwin's writing,
Right.
but this was a great way to publicize these issues.
Right.
And there was a group of kind of progressive theologians in the Church of England who published a set of essays that accepted transmutationary kinds of theories. Other parts of the Church of England went haywire. So
Yeah.
there was...
It depends on the
Right.
interpretation.
So I'm wondering, and I genuinely don't know this, if that kind of a start, the theory getting off to that kind of a start laid the groundwork for the sorts of conflicts that you're describing in contemporary stakes.
That's impossible.
I mean, again, not to push us where we can't live together, but isn't it the case that you, Richard, as a primatologist, are not, how should we say, only happen to be interested in the particular animal, namely chimpanzees, that you know a great deal about, but are interested in the relationship of chimpanzees to human origins, and that the kinds of questions that you ask from your study, what are the origins of human violence and warfare, or how did humans acquire the brains that enable us to process the things that we do? Those questions, I won't say are religious questions, but they run on tracks. They're not on parallel tracks. They're actually, I think it's extremely difficult to keep there from being some kind of collision.
Well, I'm bound to agree, I must say. It came home for me in practice in 2009, which was the 200th anniversary of Darwin's death, and the British Council held a meeting in Egypt, hoping to have some kind of synthesis of thought with Islamic scholars. And I would say the email chain went on for months afterwards with anyone from an Islamic country objecting to the notion of evolutionary theory. It was impossible to find any kind of resolution. And I think it's right that there really is a clash. I mean, for me, as a classic boring old materialist, I think that what evolutionary theory has done is given us a really wonderful story of human origins that reduces God to a personification of the interests of the people who purvey the story of God. And it's a really fascinating use of myth and story in terms of its social consequences. But it's not a story about our origins.
Richard, I have many Muslim friends throughout the world. I don't know one who doesn't accept evolutionary theory. So perhaps it was the ones that were drawn into that particular discussion. No, I just mean I think we have to be really careful about assuming that this dichotomy is universal. I want to ask both of you, if I could, something I've always been dying to ask evolutionary biologists. if we were, say, beavers, and we were building dams in the shape of the Taj Mahal or the Western Wall or the Vatican or, the pyramids of Teotihuacan, wouldn't evolutionary biologists be interested in those? But because of human exceptionalism, there doesn't seem to be a really powerful and robust and multivalent exploration of religion, religious structures as part of evolution. Since we agree we're animals, we're evolved primates, we're interested in, wasp nests and beaver dams, but we are not interested in religion as an evolutionary entity, other than the more basic, simplistic theories that say, oh, it's a coping mechanism, or it's a form of social cohesion. I always want to say more. What else can you say about it? I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I'm just wondering.
You introduced me to your Islamic scholars. I'll introduce you to all the religious scholars in evolution.
Yeah.
It's a big area. There's tremendous excitement about exploring all sorts of ideas about the multiple functions of religion.
Within an evolutionary framework, since we're primates.
Absolutely.
Okay, that would be great. Yeah, because I don't hear that. I hear them carefully patrolled and separated, and human exceptionalism becomes exhausting in a way. Yeah.
Oh well, sorry. It is restricted to analysis of human thought.
Yes.
Because
but
primates don't do it.
Well, I think Jane Goodall might disagree.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, well, I've interviewed her on it, but that's okay. We'll talk later.
I know what you're thinking about.
No, I'm not. We'll talk later. Okay.
Because chimpanzees throw rocks under waterfalls, and people have said maybe these waterfall displays are worshipping nature in some way.
Okay, she said that, but let's stick to the Taj Mahal. So you're saying that those monuments and forms of religious thought, etc., are being thought about evolutionarily, as far as what they do for us, for example.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great.
I think on this note of simultaneous disagreement and a concord, it might be an appropriate time to thank you all and thank my fellow panelists.